In the autumn of 1944, as Allied and Soviet forces continued to push into German-held territory, the Third Reich sought new methods to delay collapse. The Nazi leadership, particularly Heinrich Himmler and Hans Adolf Brützmann, to whom Himmler delegated authority over special defense, initiated plans for a clandestine commando force known as Werewolf, or Werewolf, intended to operate behind advancing enemy lines. The geopolitical context was one of imminent defeat. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies had liberated large swaths of Ukraine and Poland. On the Western Front, Allied breakthroughs following D-Day threatened the heart of Germany. Nazi strategic calculations shifted from advancing to delaying, and Werewolf emerged in this setting as a weapon of attrition. Its dual purpose, real operations and psychological warfare, reflected Germany's desperate equilibrium between military adaptation and propaganda. Public sentiment, as shaped by Nazi propaganda, emphasized total resistance. Minister of Propaganda. Joseph Goebbels cultivated the myth of a partisan uprising, emphasizing civilian participation. His radio broadcasts in March 1945, delivered on what was dubbed Radio Werewolf, portrayed civilians as stealthy fighters. "Lily the werewolf is my name. I bite, I eat, I am not tame." Operational readiness, however, presented a different picture. Estimates suggest that up to 5,000 individuals received guerrilla training under Operation Werewolf, drawn from Hitler Youth and Nazi Party affiliates. Training sites were established in areas such as the Rhineland and near Berlin. Weapon caches and explosives had been buried as early as 1939, though by 1945 their locations were largely forgotten or overrunnable by advancing forces. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence and command interpreted Werewolf not only as a potential guerrilla threat, but as a psychological tactic intended to sow paranoia. American reports from May 1945 stressed that the Werewolf organization is not a myth, demonstrating the extent to which the Allies took the notion seriously. Newspapers ran sensational headlines: "Fury of Nazi werewolves to be unleashed," contributing to Allied anxieties even where military activities were limited. Estimates of practical impact vary. Some actions attributed to Werewolf include the assassination of the mayor of Aachen, Franz Oppenhoff, and possibly an American general, though records remain disputed. Beyond isolated incidents, guerrilla operations seemed sparse and largely ineffective, lacking coordination, supplies, or sustainable command, especially as Germany collapsed. Thus, with defeat looming, Hitler's regime conceived Werewolf both as an elite paramilitary formation and a myth employed in propaganda. On one side stood limited preparations, up to several thousand trained in shadow warfare. On the other, powerful broadcasts and media narratives aimed at scaring occupiers and sustaining German resistance. The disparity between intent and execution set the stage for a layered campaign that blended military planning with myth-making at the war's end. When the Soviet encirclement of the German Sixth Army was confirmed on the 23rd of November 1942, the situation inside the Stalingrad pocket began to deteriorate rapidly. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus reported acute shortages of food, ammunition, and winter equipment. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the surrounded force could be supplied entirely by air, a claim contradicted by Luftwaffe officers on the ground who knew the capacity of available transport aircraft was insufficient for the daily requirement of 700 to 800 tons. In Berlin, the High Command debated the next step. While Hitler insisted on holding Stalingrad for political and strategic reasons, the Wehrmacht's operational planners considered the possibility of a relief operation. In Army Group Don's headquarters, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein took command on 24th of November with the explicit mission to stabilize the front and, if possible, relieve Paulus's trapped forces. Manstein evaluated the strategic map. The Soviets had established firm positions around the pocket, with the Don and Chir rivers as their defensive lines to the west and the Volga to the east. The Red Army had committed significant forces to maintain the encirclement, including elements of the 65th, 24th, and 66th Armies to the north, and the 62nd and 64th Armies to the south. Soviet reserves were considerable, but their logistics were also under strain from the rapid advance and harsh winter conditions. The German relief plan, later codenamed Operation Wintergitter, envisioned the 4th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hermann Hoth, breaking through Soviet lines from the southwest along the Kotelnikovo axis. This location was selected because Soviet defenses there were assessed as lighter compared to other sectors. The relief force consisted of approximately 1,000 men, supported by about 230 tanks, many of them newly delivered Panzer IV AUSF G models with improved long-barreled guns. Additional support came from motorized infantry and artillery units transferred from quieter sectors, as well as elements of the Luftwaffe for close air support. On the Soviet side, intelligence quickly detected German movements. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, reinforced the threatened sector with the 51st Army and mobilized mechanized reserves, including the 4th Mechanized Corps under General Vasily Volsky. Soviet commanders, anticipating a German attempt to break the encirclement, prepared to absorb and counter any thrust toward the pocket. They were under strict orders from Stalin to prevent any contact between Paulus's 6th Army and Manstein's relief force. As preparations continued, weather conditions worsened. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, and snowstorms reduced visibility, complicating both air reconnaissance and ground movement. Supply lines for the German relief force were stretched across vulnerable railway lines and roads that were under frequent attack from Soviet partisans. Fuel shortages were a constant concern, especially for the armored units. Despite these challenges, Hitler's directive remained unchanged. The 6th Army was to hold its ground, and the relief would come to them. By early December 1942, the German buildup at Kotelnikovo was largely complete. Units such as the 6th Panzer Division, recently transferred from France and still in the process of acclimating to the Eastern Front's harsh conditions, arrived to bolster the offensive capability. Manstein pressed for permission to allow Paulus to attempt a breakout toward the approaching relief force once the attack began, but Hitler categorically refused, insisting that Stalingrad be held at all costs. This decision would define the operational framework of Wintergitter and set the stage for the confrontation that followed. Operation Wintergitter was launched on 12 December 1942, with the 4th Panzer Army spearheading the offensive from the Kotelnikovo area toward the northern bend of the Aksai River. The initial axis of advance targeted Soviet positions held by elements of the 302nd Rifle Division and other formations of the 51st Army. At the outset, German armored formations achieved rapid gains, aided by concentrated Luftwaffe strikes that disrupted Soviet defensive lines and command posts. Panzer spearheads, particularly from the 6th Panzer Division, advanced up to 40 kilometers in the first 2 days, pushing Soviet forces back toward the Mishkova River. This performance temporarily revived hopes within German command circles that the relief of the 6th Army was achievable. Soviet resistance, however, intensified quickly. Reinforcements from the 4th Mechanized Corps, including over 200 T-34 medium tanks, were rushed to the sector. These units engaged German armor in a series of battles along the frozen steppe, where open terrain favored long-range tank duels, but also exposed attackers to concentrated anti-tank fire. Soviet artillery, deployed in depth, proved effective at halting infantry support elements, slowing the German advance. The Red Air Force, though limited by weather conditions, conducted intermittent sorties to harass German columns and disrupt supply movements. Logistical constraints began to affect the German pace almost immediately. The panzer divisions were operating at extended supply ranges, with fuel deliveries dependent on vulnerable road and rail links that were frequently targeted by Soviet aircraft and partisan sabotage. Ammunition stocks, particularly for the high-velocity 75mm guns of the Panzer IV, were consumed at a rate higher than anticipated due to the intensity of engagements. The onset of renewed snowstorms further complicated resupply and slowed armored thrusts to less than 10 kilometers per day. Despite these difficulties, German forces reached the Mishkova River by 19th December, bringing them within roughly 48 kilometers of the southern perimeter of the Stalingrad pocket. For Paulus's Sixth Army, the sound of distant artillery and reports from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that the relief force was approaching. However, Paulus's formations were themselves in no condition to mount a breakout. Many units were reduced to a fraction of their original strength, with infantry battalions sometimes numbering fewer than 100 men. Horses, used for transport within the pocket, were dying from lack of fodder, and air supply efforts had fallen far short, delivering barely 90 tons per day on average, a fraction of the minimum needed. At this juncture, Manstein renewed his request for permission to have Paulus attempt a breakout toward the Mishkova River. He argued that a coordinated move could link the Sixth Army with Hoth's spearheads, potentially allowing the encircled forces to retreat westward before Soviet reinforcements sealed the gap. Hitler's refusal was unequivocal. Stalingrad was to be held, and Paulus was to remain in place until the relief force physically reached the pocket. This order left Hoth's army with the entire burden of closing the distance under increasingly unfavorable conditions. Soviet High Command, aware of the danger posed by the German advance, prepared a counterstroke. The 2nd Guards Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Rodion Malinovsky, was transferred to the threatened sector. Well-equipped and relatively fresh, this formation represented a significant escalation in Soviet defensive capability. As German armored spearheads attempted to force crossings over the Mishkova River, they were met with determined resistance, heavy artillery bombardments, and coordinated counterattacks. The balance of momentum was beginning to shift, setting the stage for the decisive battles that would determine the fate of Wintergitter. The arrival of the 2nd Guards Army on 19th December 1942 marked a fundamental change in the operational landscape of Operation Wintergitter. Malinovsky's forces, numbering over 90,000 men and supported by more than 700 tanks, were concentrated along the Mishkova River sector. Their mission was clear: prevent any link-up between Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and the encircled 6th Army in Stalingrad. The Soviet units deployed in depth, creating multiple defensive belts that combined field fortifications, minefields, and concealed anti-tank positions to maximize attrition on the attacking Germans. The German spearhead, spearheaded by the 6th Panzer Division and supported by the 23rd Panzer Division, attempted to push bridgeheads across the Mishkova. In the opening engagements, they managed to secure partial crossings under the cover of concentrated Luftwaffe support. Ju A-87 Stuka dive bombers, operating in small but intense sorties, targeted Soviet artillery batteries and tank assembly areas. Nevertheless, the density of Soviet fire meant that each kilometer gained came at a high cost in vehicles and personnel. Several panzer companies were reduced to fewer than a dozen operational tanks after days of continuous fighting. Soviet countermeasures were rapid and aggressive. Malinovsky launched coordinated counterattacks involving T-34s supported by mechanized infantry and massed Katyusha rocket batteries. These strikes aimed not only to blunt German gains, but also to push them back from the river line entirely. The open, frozen steppe gave Soviet armor freedom to maneuver, and they exploited flanking opportunities whenever German units became overextended. While the Germans retained tactical skill in defense, their ability to recover lost ground after counterattacks was increasingly limited by dwindling reserves. Compounding these battlefield difficulties was the worsening logistical situation. The German supply chain from the railhead at Kotelnikovo was stretched over 150 kilometers, with only a handful of usable roads. Snow, ice, and intermittent Soviet air raids disrupted convoys, while mechanical breakdowns further reduced the availability of operational trucks. Fuel shortages became critical. Armored spearheads sometimes halted not because of enemy fire, but because fuel resupply could not keep pace with the rate of consumption in deep winter conditions. This logistical drag forced Hoth to concentrate his efforts on maintaining a narrow corridor of advance, rather than attempting broad flanking movements that could have bypassed Soviet strongpoints. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the situation was deteriorating even faster. By late December, frostbite cases numbered in the thousands. Rations had been cut to a few hundred grams per day, and most heavy weapons lacked adequate ammunition. Luftwaffe transport aircraft continued daily supply flights, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire inflicted steady losses, further reducing the volume delivered. Intelligence reports indicated that Paulus's formations would be physically incapable of mounting a breakout by early January without significant external assistance. Manstein, recognizing that time was working decisively against the relief effort, again pressed Hitler for authorization to coordinate an escape. Hitler's rejection remained firm, reiterating that the Sixth Army must hold its positions in Stalingrad for political and symbolic reasons. This decision effectively locked Wintergitter into a race it could not win, against Soviet reinforcements, against the collapsing strength of the Sixth Army, and against the advancing calendar. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation between Hoth's exhausted panzer divisions and Malinovsky's fresh guards formations, a clash that would decide not only the fate of the operation, but also the strategic balance on the southern sector of the Eastern Front. By 21st December 1942, the German advance towards Stalingrad had slowed to a crawl. The spearheads of 4th Panzer Army were within roughly 50 kilometers of the outer edge of the Soviet encirclement, yet the distance might as well have been twice that, given the resistance they now faced. The Mishkova River line had become the decisive barrier. Soviet artillery, pre-sighted on likely crossing points, kept up a near-constant barrage, while mobile anti-tank detachments waited for any attempted German bridgehead to form before striking hard with concentrated fire and armored countercharges. The 6th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced units in the Wehrmacht, fought stubbornly to expand its footholds across the river. The men were exhausted from days of continuous movement and combat in sub-zero temperatures. Many tanks were immobilized by frozen lubricants or damaged suspensions, forcing crews to cannibalize parts from wrecked vehicles. Yet they pressed on, relying on tight infantry-tank coordination to repel Soviet counterattacks and inch forward. The 17th Panzer Division on the left flank attempted to secure a wider front, but its advance was checked by well-dug-in rifle divisions, supported by artillery concentrations from across the river. The Soviets were not simply holding, they were preparing for a decisive blow. Intelligence gathered from reconnaissance flights and prisoner interrogations convinced Malinovsky that the Germans were at the limit of their offensive potential. He therefore shifted his operational stance from defensive containment to active disruption. Between 22 and 23 December, multiple Soviet armored brigades, reinforced with Guards infantry, launched a series of short, sharp assaults designed to push the Germans back from key approaches and to inflict maximum attrition on their armored units. These attacks cost the Soviets heavily in tanks, but succeeded in further reducing the already limited offensive tempo of Hoth's forces. In parallel, the wider strategic situation was turning against the Germans. North of Stalingrad, Operation Little Saturn was unfolding, with Soviet forces targeting the Italian 8th Army and threatening the rear areas of Army Group Don. This development forced Manstein to reconsider his commitment of reserves. Divisions that might have reinforced Wintergitter were now earmarked for the stabilization of collapsing Allied fronts to the northwest. Each day brought new reports of Soviet breakthroughs that could cut the Kotelnikovo corridor entirely if left unchecked. Within the Stalingrad pocket, the 6th Army was reaching the breaking point. Field reports described artillery batteries reduced to a handful of shells, hospitals overflowing with frostbitten and malnourished men, and frontline infantry unable to rotate from their positions for days at a time. Requests from Paulus for a coordinated breakout remained unanswered or were met with vague assurances from higher command. The Luftwaffe continued to risk supply flights into the shrinking airfields inside the pocket, but the tonnage delivered was a fraction of the daily requirement. Increasingly, critical supplies such as aviation fuel were diverted to enable fighter escorts, further reducing the flow of food and ammunition. By 24th of December, the situation was clear to most German field officers. Without a major breakthrough within days, the opportunity to link up with Stalingrad would vanish entirely. However, the same day brought the Soviet counterstroke that would seal Wintergivitter's fate. Malinovsky ordered a full-scale counteroffensive along the Mishkova front, using fresh tank brigades and Guards rifle divisions to smash into the German spearheads. The fighting was intense and costly, but the weight of Soviet manpower, armor, and artillery gradually pushed the Germans back toward their starting positions. The pressure was now twofold. direct combat losses at the front, and the strategic threat of encirclement from the north due to the success of Little Saturn. German commanders recognized that continuing the advance risked trapping 4th Panzer Army in the open steppe. In the final days of December, discussions within Army Group Dawn shifted from how to relieve Stalingrad to how to preserve the forces still outside the pocket. The relief operation was entering its terminal phase, not because of a single decisive defeat, but due to the cumulative effect of attrition, overextension, and an enemy able to fight effectively on multiple fronts simultaneously. The withdrawal from the Mishkova river line began under conditions that reflected the broader collapse of the German position in southern Russia. By 25 December 1942, orders from Manstein authorized Hoth to pull 4th Panzer Army back to more defensible positions near Kotelnikovo. The retreat was conducted in stages to avoid a rout, with rearguard units covering the disengagement, while engineers destroyed bridges and laid mines to slow the Soviet advance. Temperatures plunged well below -20 degrees Celsius, complicating movement and worsening the mechanical failures already plaguing the Panzer. Soviet forces pursued aggressively. Malinovsky committed additional mechanized units to maintain pressure on the withdrawing Germans, hoping to prevent them from re-establishing a coherent front. Reconnaissance aircraft reported German columns stretching for kilometers, their progress slowed by snowdrifts and intermittent Soviet artillery fire. Several rearguard actions, notably by elements of the 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, delayed Soviet breakthroughs, but at significant cost in both men and materiel. Fuel shortages became acute. In many cases, tanks were abandoned after crews siphoned remaining fuel into operational vehicles to keep the formation mobile. The withdrawal coincided with the intensification of Soviet operations elsewhere on the front. To the northwest, the Red Army's advances during Operation Little Saturn forced the Germans to divert their already strained reserves toward Rostov and the Donets Basin. The collapse of Axis satellite armies, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian, left long stretches of the front virtually undefended, creating opportunities for deep Soviet penetrations. This development threatened to isolate not only 6th Army, but also the forces attempting its relief. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, Paulus received confirmation on 26 December that the relief effort had stalled. While no formal order to attempt a breakout was issued, it was clear to divisional commanders that the window for any coordinated movement had closed. The 6th Army's situation continued to deteriorate. Bread rations fell below 200 grams per day. Horses were slaughtered to provide meat, and artillery positions were manned by crews with minimal ammunition. Frostbite and disease began to claim more soldiers than combat itself. German high command faced a strategic dilemma. Continuing to hold positions around Kotelnikovo risked encirclement of 4th Panzer Army, yet abandoning them meant conceding the initiative in southern Russia entirely. The decision ultimately favored preservation of mobile forces over the increasingly untenable defense of Stalingrad. Orders emphasized rapid reorganization for future defensive operations along the Don and in the approaches to Rostov, where Soviet advances now posed a direct threat to the Caucasus supply lines. The Soviet command understood the broader implications of forcing the German withdrawal. Although Wintergitter had failed to achieve its immediate objective, the operation had drawn significant German armored strength into a sector where it could now be systematically degraded. Malinovsky's forces exploited this by launching continuous attacks against retreating German formations, targeting supply depots, fuel dumps, and repair workshops. By early January 1943, many German armored units in the sector were reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength, often fewer than a dozen operational tanks per division. This phase of the campaign marked the irreversible shift in the strategic balance around Stalingrad. The failure of the relief attempt eliminated the last realistic hope of extricating 6th Army. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Red Army could not only encircle large enemy formations, but also withstand and repel major mechanized counteroffensives. The German forces now faced the dual challenge of defending a collapsing front in the south, while preparing for renewed Soviet offensives across the broader Eastern Front. Wintergitter had ended not with a decisive battle, but with the slow, costly erosion of German operational capacity, setting the stage for the final destruction of Sixth Army in the weeks ahead. By early January 1943, the German retreat from the Kotelnikovo sector had stabilized along a new defensive line west of the Monik River, but the implications of the failed relief operation were already evident. The 4th Panzer Army, though still a coherent force, had been reduced in combat effectiveness, fuel shortages persisted, and the severe winter cold continued to disable vehicles and exhaust men. The once formidable concentration of armor that spearheaded Wintergitter was now a depleted core, with many divisions operating at a fraction of their authorized strength. Some panzer regiments had fewer than 10 operational tanks, while infantry units were understrength due to combat losses and frostbite casualties. For the Soviet command, this was the moment to consolidate gains and prepare for the next phase. Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army, having pushed the Germans back from the Mishkova, shifted to defensive regrouping, while adjacent Soviet formations pressed forward elsewhere on the southern front. Coordination between fronts was now critical. The Stalingrad encirclement remained the top priority for the Soviet High Command, Stavka, and the forces freed from halting the relief attempt could now be redirected toward tightening the noose around Paulus. Soviet planners anticipated that the trapped 6th Army would exhaust its supplies within weeks, if not sooner, and their operations increasingly aimed at preventing any possibility of air resupply or localized breakout attempts. The Luftwaffe's role diminished sharply during this stage. Severe weather grounded many supply flights, and Soviet air superiority in the region further restricted German transport aircraft from reaching Potomnik and Gumrak airfields inside the pocket. Losses among Ju-52 transport planes and A-111 bombers were mounting, and fuel shortages in the Reich limited the number of replacement aircraft available. By January, daily deliveries to the encircled army averaged less than 1/3 of the required tonnage. This logistical breakdown sealed the fate of Paulus's forces. Meanwhile, in Berlin and at the German Southern Command headquarters, there was recognition that the Stalingrad pocket could no longer be saved without jeopardizing the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. Manstein, though reluctant to abandon the attempt, now concentrated on extracting his remaining mobile forces before they too risked encirclement. His reports to OKH stressed the need for strategic withdrawals to shorten the front and create reserves capable of responding to further Soviet offensives. The priority shifted from rescuing 6th Army to preventing the collapse of Army Group A in the Caucasus, where German formations were still operating deep in enemy territory. For Soviet leadership, the failed German relief attempt had confirmed the effectiveness of their defensive and counteroffensive strategy. By fixing the German armored reserves in the south and inflicting attritional losses, they had ensured that the Stalingrad encirclement could be maintained until the defenders' collapse. This not only promised a major victory, but also allowed Soviet forces to prepare for broader winter offensives across the Eastern Front, from Leningrad to the Donbass. On the ground, the German retreat had immediate consequences for local populations. Villages abandoned by the Wehrmacht were quickly reoccupied by advancing Soviet troops, often revealing extensive destruction from scorched earth measures. Food stores, livestock, and even building materials had been removed or destroyed to deny them to the enemy. Civilians faced shortages and harsh reprisals if suspected of aiding the Germans during the occupation. In some cases, Soviet partisans who had operated behind the front lines emerged to assist the Red Army's advance, providing intelligence on retreating units and sabotaging abandoned German supply points. The morale contrast between the opposing forces was stark. German units, though disciplined, understood that their winter campaign had failed to achieve its primary aim. Many soldiers recognized that the withdrawal marked a turning point in the Southern Theater, where the initiative had now passed decisively to the Red Army. Conversely, Soviet troops drew confidence from their success in halting and repelling a major German mechanized thrust, reinforcing the belief that the Red Army had permanently shifted the momentum of the war in the East. The events following the withdrawal from the Mishkova line thus bridged the operational failure of Wintergitter with the impending collapse of 6th Army. While the relief force regrouped to defend against future Soviet attacks, Paulus's men remained trapped, their supplies dwindling, and their options narrowing to surrender or destruction. The operational lessons from this phase: on the limits of mobile warfare in winter conditions, the vulnerability of extended supply lines, and the decisive role of coordinated multi-front operations would resonate through the remainder of the Stalingrad campaign. As January 1943 progressed, the situation within the Stalingrad pocket deteriorated rapidly. The failure of Operation Wintergitter had extinguished the last realistic hope of relief, and the German Sixth Army now faced the inevitability of encirclement to the end. Supplies had dwindled to the point where daily rations for soldiers were reduced to minimal bread portions, supplemented by frozen horse meat when available. Ammunition was equally scarce. Artillery units often fired only a few shells per day to conserve resources, and many frontline infantry positions relied on captured Soviet weapons with whatever ammunition could be salvaged. Medical conditions inside the pocket worsened dramatically. Field hospitals operated without adequate heating, light, or sterile equipment, and the shortage of drugs meant that even treatable wounds frequently became fatal due to infection or frostbite. Thousands of wounded men lay in makeshift shelters, often on bare floors, with little hope of evacuation as Soviet forces tightened their ring. Pitomnik airfield, the main lifeline for air evacuation, came under heavy artillery and air attack, rendering it increasingly dangerous for the already overstretched Luftwaffe transport crews. By mid-January, Pitomnik was lost entirely, forcing all remaining air operations to shift to the smaller and less capable Gumrak airstrip. Outside the pocket, the Red Army prepared to exploit the momentum gained from the failure of Wintergitter. Stavka ordered a coordinated offensive by the Don and Stalingrad fronts to finish the encircled army, while the southern front pressed westward against the retreating elements of Army Group Don. This phase of operations was carefully timed to prevent any regrouping of German forces that might attempt another relief, however unlikely. The Soviet strategy combined heavy artillery bombardments with infantry assaults supported by tanks, gradually compressing the perimeter and forcing the Germans into ever smaller defensive sectors. German command faced increasingly difficult decisions. Manstein, now fully aware that further relief attempts were impossible without catastrophic losses elsewhere, focused on extracting Army Group A from the Caucasus before Soviet breakthroughs could trap them as well. This meant that the Sixth Army was effectively left to hold out as long as possible to tie down Soviet forces and buy time for other German formations to retreat to defensible positions along the Mius and Dnieper rivers. In Berlin, Hitler still insisted on holding Stalingrad, believing that a surrender would deal an unacceptable blow to German prestige and morale, both domestically and among Axis allies. This political determination to resist at all costs condemned Paulus's forces to their fate. The Soviet High Command, for its part, recognized the propaganda value of capturing the Sixth Army intact. Orders were issued to minimize opportunities for breakout and to maintain psychological pressure through continuous bombardment and propaganda leaflets urging surrender. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast messages promising humane treatment for those who laid down their arms, alongside reminders that relief had failed and that resistance was futile. The effectiveness of this psychological campaign varied. Some units fought with grim determination, while others, demoralized by hunger and hopelessness, began to show signs of collapse. As the encirclement contracted, conditions for civilians in and around Stalingrad remained dire. Many had survived months of bombardment, living in cellars and subsisting on whatever food they could scavenge. Soviet reoccupation of devastated districts brought little immediate relief, as infrastructure was obliterated and winter temperatures made rebuilding impossible. Civilian accounts describe scenes of frozen corpses in the streets, destroyed housing, and widespread shortages of basic necessities. By the third week of January, the perimeter of the Sixth Army had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Defensive sectors became dangerously thin, with some companies holding frontages intended for entire battalions. The collapse of organized defense was increasingly visible. Isolated pockets of resistance formed as Soviet assaults severed communication lines and fragmented the German command structure. The once cohesive battle plan to defend Stalingrad had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival in the ruins of a city already synonymous with destruction. This stage marked the final consequence of Wintergitter's failure, the transformation of the Sixth Army from a major fighting force into a surrounded, starving remnant awaiting the inevitable end. The inability of the relief operation to break through had not only doomed the encircled troops, but had also allowed the Soviets to consolidate their position on the southern front, paving the way for wider strategic offensives that would, in the months ahead, push the Wehrmacht into a sustained retreat across the entire Eastern Front. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army's situation had become untenable. The front line had contracted to a narrow strip of land centered around the ruins of central Stalingrad, with German troops occupying a shrinking cluster of defensive zones that were under constant Soviet pressure from all directions. The Soviets, executing Operation Ring, applied systematic pressure. Massed artillery barrages were followed by coordinated infantry and tank assaults that pushed back German positions block by block. Each day the perimeter shrank, and the remaining airstrip at Gumrak became unusable after sustained bombardment, severing the last tenuous lifeline for supplies or evacuation. Command communications broke down as the Soviet advance cut through German positions. Telephone lines were destroyed, radio batteries ran out of power, and runners often never returned. Isolated units fought on without orders, relying on local initiative. Ammunition shortages became critical. Artillery crews abandoned their guns once their final shells were fired, while infantry often engaged Soviet troops with only small arms and minimal ammunition, supplemented in some cases by captured Soviet weapons. The cold was unrelenting, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, worsening frostbite cases, and rendering the dead and wounded frozen in place where they had fallen. Paulus, now operating from a heavily fortified cellar in the city center, was confronted with the collapse of his defensive sectors. Reports reached him of entire companies surrendering after exhausting their ammunition and food. Still, orders from Hitler were explicit. No surrender was to be considered. The Sixth Army was to hold its ground and fight to the last man, both as a matter of principle and to tie down Soviet forces. Paulus's generals, including his chief of staff Schmidt, understood that these orders meant the destruction of the army, yet openly defying the Führer's directive was not considered an option. Soviet forces, recognizing the state of the German defenses, began to capture significant numbers of prisoners. Many were frostbitten, malnourished, and too weak to resist. Captured soldiers described their rations as consisting of a few slices of bread per day, sometimes supplemented with soup made from horse meat or boiled leather. Disease was rampant, with dysentery and typhus spreading rapidly among troops living in overcrowded, unheated shelters. The physical and psychological exhaustion was evident. Many prisoners displayed little reaction to their capture, too weakened to offer resistance or even speak. Civilian survivors within the city, few in number after months of siege, witnessed the collapse of the German position firsthand. Accounts from Soviet reports describe scenes of ruined buildings turned into defensive strongholds, filled with both wounded soldiers and starving civilians. In many cases, German and Soviet wounded lay side by side in makeshift shelters, awaiting either medical attention or the inevitable end of hostilities in their sector. The Soviet command maintained its emphasis on swift, coordinated advances, preventing the Germans from regrouping or establishing fallback positions. Armored spearheads cut the pocket into smaller and smaller sections, isolating and overwhelming individual strongpoints. The tightening of the encirclement mirrored Soviet strategy across the Eastern Front at the time: neutralize enemy mobility, then destroy isolated elements in sequence. By January 28th, the Sixth Army was split into two distinct pockets: a southern sector, including Paulus's headquarters in the city center, and a northern sector near the factory district. The northern pocket, cut off from all resupply and already critically weakened, collapsed within days under heavy bombardment and infantry assault. Those who survived were marched into captivity, adding to the growing number of German prisoners being sent to collection points along the Volga. Paulus's situation in the southern pocket became increasingly hopeless. Soviet forces were now only hundreds of meters from his headquarters, and the noise of constant artillery and tank fire reverberated through the ruins. Food supplies had run out entirely. The remaining defenders survived on whatever could be scavenged from abandoned stockpiles or from the dead. The defensive lines were now manned by fragments of units, sometimes as few as 10 to 15 men holding positions meant for entire companies. At this stage, the consequences of Operation Wintergitter's failure were fully realized. The relief force had withdrawn weeks earlier, the encircled army had been cut into fragments, and the Sixth Army was beyond salvation. The final days of combat were no longer about achieving victory or even holding ground. They were about enduring until the inevitable surrender. A surrender that would mark one of the most significant turning points in the Second World War on the Eastern Front. The surrender of the Sixth Army unfolded in stages, beginning on January 31st, 1943, when Soviet units broke through to the immediate vicinity of Paulus's command post in the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad. Surrounded and without the means to continue effective resistance, Paulus was confronted with an ultimatum delivered by Soviet envoys. For the first time, he had to consider defying Hitler's explicit orders not to capitulate. Within hours, he informed Soviet representatives that he would accept their terms, effectively ending organized resistance in the southern pocket. Paulus himself, recently promoted to field marshal in a symbolic act intended by Hitler to encourage suicide rather than surrender, became the highest-ranking German officer ever captured alive up to that point. While Paulus and his immediate staff were taken into custody, fighting continued in the northern pocket for 2 more days. Isolated groups of German soldiers, often cut off from any central command, continued to resist in the factory district and along the Volga embankment. Soviet forces systematically reduced these positions with concentrated artillery and infantry assaults. On February 2nd, the last significant German positions were overrun, and the final survivors surrendered. The Soviet command reported taking approximately 91,000 prisoners from both pockets combined, including 24 generals. These prisoners were in such poor physical condition that many could not walk unassisted. Thousands died within days due to wounds, starvation, and exposure. The immediate aftermath of the surrender saw the Red Army consolidate control over the city. Soviet engineers and medical units began clearing mines, recovering bodies, and attempting to restore minimal services. The scale of devastation was almost total. Entire districts were reduced to rubble, the Volga shoreline was littered with wrecked equipment, and tens of thousands of bodies lay buried beneath the ruins. For the Soviets, the victory was both a strategic and symbolic triumph, marking the first large-scale destruction of a German army in the war, and proving that the Wehrmacht could be decisively defeated on the Eastern Front. For Germany, the loss of the Sixth Army was a military disaster with far-reaching consequences. The destruction of an entire field army, approximately 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, was a blow from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover in terms of manpower, morale, and prestige. The myth of German invincibility, cultivated since 1939, was irreparably damaged. In the weeks following the surrender, news from Stalingrad was carefully managed by Nazi propaganda, which framed the defeat as a heroic stand against overwhelming odds. However, among the German population and within the military, the psychological impact was profound. On the Soviet side, the victory at Stalingrad significantly boosted morale and strengthened the political position of Joseph Stalin, both domestically and internationally. It also cemented the Soviet Union's role as a decisive force in the Allied coalition. The battle's outcome encouraged Britain and the United States to increase their support through Lend-Lease and to accelerate plans for opening a second front in Europe. Politically, the surrender influenced the diplomatic environment. Neutral states, particularly Turkey and Spain, recalculated their positions toward Germany. Axis allies, such as Hungary, Romania, and Italy, whose forces had also suffered heavy losses in the Stalingrad campaign, grew more cautious and less willing to commit large troop formations to the Eastern Front. In military terms, the collapse at Stalingrad opened the way for a sustained Soviet counteroffensive along a wide front. Within weeks, the Red Army launched operations that pushed German forces hundreds of kilometers westward, reclaiming large areas of southern Russia. Although the Wehrmacht managed to stabilize the front later in 1943, it was now forced onto a largely defensive footing for the remainder of the war in the east. The historical legacy of Operation Wintergitter and the failed relief of Stalingrad lies in the demonstration of how strategic overreach, combined with rigid command decisions and the inability to adapt to changing circumstances, can lead to catastrophic defeat. The relief operation's failure sealed the fate of the Sixth Army, and its destruction became one of the defining episodes of the Second World War. Today, Stalingrad is remembered not only as a military turning point, but also as a case study in the interplay of strategy, logistics, leadership, and human endurance under extreme conditions.